In this video, I'm going to try and convince you why every 3-blind cuber should be learning multi right away. How's it going, everyone? My name's James. I'm a movement coach specializing in the brain and nervous system. I spend the majority of my time coaching very, very tiny and small aspects of people's movement, how they're breathing, where they're looking, what their balance is like. But in my own practice, I'm also a decent enough cuber, with my main event being Multiblind. This video is going to be quite opinion heavy. I'm going to be suggesting that one of the best ways that you can solidify your memo in blind solving is through extensively practicing multi-blind as much as possible. But I'm going to try and throw a little bit of science in there. We'll be discussing the idea of spaced repetition to try and explain why I think multi-blind might be better than just doing loads and loads of blind solves. This isn't the way that I learned to do things, and I don't think very many people have gotten into multi-blind quite so early on when it comes to blind solving. But if you know of any real life examples, please feel free to share them. I'm really curious to hear how other people have approached blind solving at the early stages. So when you look on the speed cubing forums, one of the biggest questions that comes up on the topic of 3-blind is, how do I go about coming up with this big long list of words for all the pairs of letters that I'm putting in my solve? Most people, they usually use names or people for their letter pairs, and it can be really, really difficult to come up with certain pairs of letters, and especially not to come up with the same person or same word for two different pairs of letters. For example, at one point I have had Homer Simpson for the letter pairs HO, HM, and HS. A lot of the time, the recommendations people give is to, create a list. Either you're going to make a spreadsheet or an Anki deck with all of the letter pairs and your names for each of them, and you're just going to test yourself regularly on this. In my opinion, that works and it's great, but it takes a lot of time, and a lot of time where you're not actually getting to do the blind solving. If we could figure out something where we combine the two things together, that would really be ideal. And for me, this subject is the specific part where a multi-blind solve might actually be a lot better than a 3-blind solve for helping to lodge the words you choose for a letter pair into your memory a lot faster. So let's say that you're going to dedicate 1 hour in your day to getting better at 3-blind. One way you could do this is scramble up one cube and trace as many times as you feel like you need to through all the letter pairs, coming up with a word for each one, and then executing, see if you get it correct, scramble it up again, and go for the next one. Alternatively, you could go for a multi-blind solve. So let's say in that hour, you're able to get through 6 cubes. So you can do 6 cubes in a row where you scramble them up, trace them, solve them, move on to the next one. Well, instead of solving them 3-blind style in a row, what if you attempted to solve them all multi-blind style, where the memorization is in one pack and the execution is in another pack? While this definitely seems more daunting at the surface level, and most likely you're probably definitely not going to see any decent results when it comes to the execution, we might get a bit of a significant boost when it comes to creating a solid list of words for our letter pairs. And the reason here is based on the principle of spaced repetition for learning. So the idea of spaced repetition is basically, if you keep trying to remember something with the same time intervals, then your brain will get used to the idea that it only needs to remember that thing for that amount of time. So if somebody tells you every 5 minutes, remember, Copenhagen is the capital of Denmark. If somebody asks you 4 minutes later, what is the capital of Denmark? You're probably going to know the answer. If they wait 6 or maybe even 10 or 12 minutes, the chances you're going to remember it drop significantly. In terms of the science of learning, what we now know to be the most effective way of putting things into long-term memory is not just using the same intervals to remind ourselves of information, but using increasing intervals that get bigger and bigger as they go on. So in that first example, somebody tells me that Copenhagen is the capital of Denmark. They are going to quiz me on that a minute later. They might then quiz me on it 2 minutes later, then 4 minutes, then 8 minutes, then 16, and it just doubles up. Eventually, we're not remembering it until tomorrow, 2 days later, 4 days later, and this means our brain realizes we're going to have to encode this into our long-term memory because we need to remember it for longer and longer periods of time. This is actually one of the strategies you need to factor in when it comes to multi-blind solving. Once you've memorized the cube, you don't want to leave it very long before you go and review it again, but you then want to leave it a little bit longer before the third time, and if you've got a fourth and fifth time, that gap wants to increase slightly more again and again. So what does this have to do with memorizing letter pairs? Well, when you're doing a 3-blind solve, you trace your cube, you get a certain number of letter pairs. Occasionally, you might get the same pair of letters in the edges as in the corners, but otherwise, you're basically going to just trace through the cube as many times as you need to, and you get a fixed phase of repetition. You'll get to the end of the cube after a minute or 2 minutes, then you're going to review it again. That's going to take another minute or 2 minutes. Maybe it's even going to take less. And each time you just have to remind yourself of that word you created for the letter pair. So the HO for Homer Simpson, if you've come up with that, when you revisit it again, if that letter pair is new to you, you have to remember what it was and then carry on. Then once you've gone through your execution, you re-scramble the cube again, you may get some similar letter pairs, you may not. Eventually you probably will get one that is the same, so you get that little spaced repetition effect, but this doesn't happen very often. It's just once or twice every cube or couple of cubes that you're going to have to remind yourself of something that you came up with a short while ago. If you were doing all 6 of these cubes in a multi-blind attempt, however, you're going to have a whole lot of spaced repetition, as well as much more likelihood that you're going to be dealing with the same letter pair coming up in different situations and different scenarios, which is going to trigger the brain to try and store it in long-term memory quicker once it realizes it might need it in different contexts and scenarios. In this case, my letter pair HO comes up in the edges on the first solve. Maybe it comes up again in the corners on the second solve, and maybe again in the sixth solve. I will have a much better version of spaced repetition going on, because not only am I going to be tracing through the first cube a couple of times till I think I've got it, then I'll probably do first cube, second cube, and then review the first one again. So that's that slightly longer increment where I'm having to remind myself of what name I chose for the letter pair. Then when I get to the third cube and it shows up in the corners, then I have to remind myself again. As it gets to the sixth cube, I've probably reviewed the first number a whole load of times. There's been varying chunks of time in between, and because it's not so fixed, my brain's putting more and more effort into committing this thing to memory. Finally, when it then comes to the execution and these letter pairs come up again, probably the execution's taking me a good bit longer to get everything done, so I'm having to wait longer and longer before I try and remember exactly what I chose for the HO letter pair. So with this strategy, you take the same amount of time, but you end up getting a lot more efficient with your letter pairing strategy. And over time, once you've had enough solves where you've got through all of the letter pairs a couple of times over, you probably find that it's a lot easier to remember all these, and you can just go back to your 3-blind solves without your memo being such an issue. So that's my thoughts. I genuinely think that that strategy will serve people better than using something like an Anki deck or a spreadsheet. That may just be me and the way that I like to do things and learn this. So let me know what you think of this in the comments. Would you consider trying something like this? Do you even have such a big chunk of time that you could devote to blind solving in the first place? Or is this just all a crazy idea from somebody who just really likes multi-blind? Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.